the next presentation, which is by Heleen Tayler of Experico, and it's about Cripps Pink internal browning and long-term storage, what has been learned.
Thank you, Richard. Can everybody hear me? Richard, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. I'll share my screen. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. Unfortunately, my camera doesn't work on Zoom, so apologies for that. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. Crips, today I will be presenting on Cripps Pink internal browning, specifically long-term storage and what has been learned. We've been part of a study over the last 3 years. Thanks to Hortgro and industry funding, and we've worked on this project in collaboration with the university. It has been a lovely chapter to include in the long run of studies that we've done on internal browning in Cripps Pink apples. Sorry, I just need to hide this quickly. There we go. So the background for this study, as we are all aware, internal browning of Cripps Pink apples is a worldwide tendency. It has cost the South African industry millions of rands in revenue, and it continues to do so from time to time. The types of internal browning have been verified. There is radial browning, diffuse browning, there is combination browning, CO2 damage or cavities, and browning in misshapen fruit. These images are just to indicate to you what they look like, the different types of internal browning. This is radial browning, where you will find browning radiating from the vascular bundles. Diffuse browning is other to radial browning. The browning is found under the peel or closer to the peel, where the vascular bundle areas wouldn't be brown as whites. And then you have combination browning, which is exactly what it says, a combination of radial and diffuse browning in one fruit. CO2 cavities in the core. I hope it's visible. There's small cavities in the core of the fruit. We found this towards the last 2 years of the study, where before we would find CO2 cavities in the flesh, such as illustrated here. And then you also get misshapen browning. These fruit can be sorted out at harvest or at packing, where you are almost always certain of finding browning in these misshapen fruit, where the browning radiates towards the misshapen or the bulged area on the fruit. So storage regimes have been adapted, where fruit are now stored above 0 degrees Celsius, and they are stored for shorter term CA storage of a maximum of 4 to 5 months. However, long-term CA storage of 7 to 9 months, for instance, is still a risk for internal browning developing. There are risk factors by which IB is determined. There's pre-harvest factors and post-harvest factors. The pre-harvest risk factors, there's various orchard factors that can play a role. There's seasonal climatic variables and harvest maturity. But there's also post-harvest factors that play a role, such as cooling rate, 1-MCP application, CA or DCA conditions, storage temperature, and also storage duration. So a possible solution is step cooling that has proven to reduce stress on fruit. So this study originated where we tested a successful step cooling regime utilized commercially in another Southern Hemisphere country in conjunction with 1-MCP to reduce internal browning potential. So just in short, some background on the layout of this trial. 2 areas were included, Ceres and Grabo, specifically the Kohe-Bokkeveld and Grabo, in order to have distinct climatic different regions, if that makes sense. Further 10 populations were included, 5 populations per area. The harvest maturity, we aimed for 30 to 40% starch breakdown. 1 MCP was applied within 7 days of harvest. And the cooling regimes we included in this study, there were 5 treatments, and I'll show them on the following slide. So the treatments, just to explain this layout, there were 5 treatments, treatment 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The fruit were harvested roughly in April, roughly around week 16 and 17, depending on the year and how they matured on the trees. Then 3 of the treatments received step cooling, treatment 1, 2, and 3. All 3 of them had step cooling. Treatment 4 and 5 did not. Then also treatment 1 to 4 were treated with 1 MCP, but treatment 5 was not. Then, to explain treatment 1, the step cooling occurred in 30-day increments. Treatment 1 starting at 4, going down 3, 2, 1, and from 2 to 1 for 30-day increments, and then 1 was the final storage temperature. And the fruit was stored for 9 months. Total storage, the CA was broken in January, where we had our first examination after CA. Then treatment 2 started at 3 degrees as opposed to 4. Treatment 3 was a commercial treatment. The fruit was stored in a commercial room. So the step cooling there was slightly different to, or considerably different to what was tested. And then treatment 4 and 5, as I've said, had no step cooling, so they were stored at 1 degrees from shortly after harvest. The examinations in the study that was included is examination of full maturity at harvest, then after the 9 months CA, after a following 4 weeks in RA at minus 0.5, and then after 7 days, there was a after shelf life examination. The fruit was stored in Yanni bins at the university. Just like to add that. So what has been learned? 3 basic principles, 3 factors that were highlighted that came to light after the 3 years of the study was to harvest at optimum maturity, to apply 1 MCP, and to step cool. I'll elaborate on each of these 3 factors in the following slides. So to harvest at optimum maturity, what I'm showing here is the maturity at harvest in the first year of the study. Just important to note that the first year of the study was a low-risk commercial browning year. If you look at the maturity of the 10 populations, 5 per area that was included in the study, it's important to note that the starch breakdown in the 2 areas varied. I won't go into too much detail, but the logistical arrangements for 10 populations to be cooled, step cooled for 30 days in the same cold room made us to have to harvest a day or 2 days apart. And with the 2 different climatic areas, this caused us having to wait for the one area to just be ready. And by that time, the other area was advanced. at first, obviously, this wasn't nice to see, because we thought, you know, we're a little bit outside, or we're quite a bit outside what we aimed for, the 30 to 40 starch breakdown. But in the end, these differences gave us good answers, if I can put it that way. Okay, so just important to notice the starch difference between the two areas. The acids were good and the firmnesses were good. In the second year of the study, this was the 2018-19 season. Important to note that this was a high-risk commercial browning year. But same trial layout, same dynamics, and again we had lower starch breakdown in the one area and higher starch breakdown in the other area. Okay, good acids, good firmness. I'll come to my point now. So year 3, first time in all the years that we've been doing pink lady internal browning studies, something different happened. We had a starch breakdown in the two areas that were very much alike. So the two areas didn't differ in starch breakdown much. They were very similar. The total acids were good. And again, the firmnesses were good. So what did we see? Why is harvest maturity important? From our study, in the first year, it was a low risk internal browning year. And from our trial, we found low internal browning results. In the second year of the study, which was a high risk internal browning year, we find high internal browning incidence. But in the third year of the study, even though it was a high risk commercial internal browning year, we found low internal browning incidence in our examinations. This makes a person think that your harvest maturity, or you come to the conclusion that harvest maturity is extremely important and can have an influence on your internal browning incidence after storage. Okay, then the second factor to apply 1-MCP. This slide illustrates the 10 populations over the 3 years of the study, and it shows the firmness at harvest maturity of the 10 populations over the 3 years. Why is it important to apply 1-MCP? I think we all are familiar with the reason for this. This is year 2 firmness results after CA. You will see that treatment 5, the treatment that did not have a 1-MCP application, at the end of CA already had very low firmnesses, where the other treatments had higher firmnesses, significantly higher. Then after shelf life, if you add the 7 kilogram bar again, over the 2 areas, again you see that if you didn't apply 1-MCP, you would have a significantly reduced firmness. Okay, in year 2, this is the year where you had where fruit of higher maturity was included in the study. In year 3, where the maturity was very similar over the 10 populations, if you add the 7 kilogram bar, you would see that after CA already, the fruit that were not subjected to 1-MCP did not make the 7 kilogram mark. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this. We understand the value of adding 1-MCP, but wonderful to see these results still. After shelf life, all the treatments that had 1-MCP had very good firmness, where the ones that didn't are below the 7 kilogram bar. Okay, now the important part as well is to step cool. This is the university facility cold rooms where the fruit were stored in the Yanni bins. Let's look at radial browning incidence results. In year 1 of the study, there was very little to no internal browning found. Therefore, those figures aren't shown. But for year 2, after CA already, internal browning incidence occurred. What you see here is after CA, year 2, for the 2 areas and the 10 populations. A person can see that the one area had slightly higher internal browning incidence, radial browning incidence, compared to the other area. But if you look at which treatments had the radial browning, the arrows indicate where treatment 4 and 5 had radial browning. So treatment 4 and 5 was highlighted as risk treatments for higher internal browning incidence occurring. Just to refresh, treatment 4 was the treatment that had no step cooling with 1 MCP, and treatment 5 was the treatment that had no step cooling and no 1 MCP. Then after RA in the same year, the incidence levels increased in percentage. And again, you can see that in most places where internal browning occurred, it was in treatment 4 and 5. Thus, it was in fruit that were not step cooled. And for diffuse browning, again, more diffuse browning in more mature fruit. So more diffuse browning in the one area compared to the other. But if you look at where diffuse browning occurred, mostly in treatment 4 and 5. This is fruit that were not step cooled, highlighting the importance of step cooling pink lady apples for long-term storage. In year 3, this was the year that had high commercial internal browning incidence. However, in this year, we did not find a lot of internal browning incidence, percentage-wise, incidence-wise, in this fruit. This is after CA, the same illustration here for the one area and the other. After CA, around 1% or less than 1% radial browning incidence. The 2 areas did not really differ much in incidence. And again, most of the places where internal browning occurred, it was in fruit that were not step cooled. After RA, remember that this is after 9 months CA storage. So we were expected to find browning, but we didn't find as much as the previous year. The interesting bit is that in this year where we didn't have, we had almost no difference in maturity between the 10 populations, similar levels of radial browning occurred in both areas, which would allude to the fact that internal browning is maturity related, not necessarily area related, although you have to take into consideration your growing degree days and all of those factors. But again, if you look here, most of the incidence of internal browning, again, in fruit that were not step cooled. And okay, I'll get to that point just now. And then after shelf life, again, no real difference seen between the incidence amount of browning between the 2 areas. And a lot of the browning incidence occurred in treatment 4 and 5, where fruit did not receive step cooling. Okay, so the key results for this study was as follows. Storing for up to 9 months CA is not recommended at this stage. IV internal browning risk is still especially in high-risk years. Storage conditions for this trial was set up for 9 months just to get treatment differences and to identify possible risk protocols or risk practices to avoid. Area differences were possibly due to harvest maturity. Then the key results for overall for the study, year 1 was a low risk year. Year 2, the 2018 season, was a high risk year with clear treatment differences, where we could see that there was a risk for radial and diffuse browning and for fruit quality if you consider firmness, if not step cooled. So you even had a firmness benefit if fruit was step cooled. And the step cooling from the protocols that we tested is recommended to start at 3 degrees. There was also a risk for radial browning, specifically radial browning identified if you step cool and subject fruit to 1 MCP. There was also a risk for radial browning, seems to be linked to less mature fruit. And diffuse browning is related to over-mature fruit and low storage temperature, which substantiates previous results. The year 3 was a higher risk year, but with our harvest maturity starch breakdown between 30 to 40%, we had much lower internal browning incidence, and the year 3 results substantiated to a great degree the results found in year 2. The results found from this study was included in the best practice guide for Cripps Pink, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the funders of the study, also our collaborators, Elke, at the university, Gustav, for storing the fruit and all the work you had looking after them, and then our team at Experico that year on year have handled and done the examinations on the Pink Lady trial. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Heleen, for a very interesting study. Let's see if there are any questions. Participants are welcome to pose their questions in Afrikaans if they feel more comfortable. Okay, it doesn't look like it. So, yeah, thank you once again. Let's move on to the next presentation.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay, now we get on to optimum storage conditions of Abate Fetel pears by Anel Botes from the ARC. Anel, please proceed.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to share my screen. Okay, Richard, can you see the screen? I just want to check. Can you hear me as well?
Proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the optimum storage conditions for Abate Fetel pears. This project has been going on for a while now. The 2020 season is actually our last season working on this. So today I'm going to present to you data from the 2019 season, and we're still busy data capturing the last evaluations data of this year. So in February 2021, we will submit the final report, putting together all the years. Okay, so currently we know that if you want to store Abate Fetel on a controlled atmosphere conditions, you can do it at 1.5% oxygen and a 0.5% carbon dioxide for up to 4 months. It's just important to remember that Abate Fetel is very susceptible to soft scald, which it develops under very low oxygen conditions, but it also develops superficial scald if stored for long term. So with this project, we wanted to see what the effect will be of different storage regimes on the quality of Abate Fetel, and if it is possible for us to store it for up to 6 months. So as I mentioned before, this data is of the 2019 season. We've got fruit from both Cripps and the cereals production area with two maturities. Optimum harvest, optimum fruit was about 2 weeks later. Then we had a list of 7 different treatments. The first 3 treatments is controlled atmosphere at 1.5% oxygen. The first treatment is a treatment that we know that we can store for 4 months. The next one and the one after that is CO at 1.5 in combination with 1 MCP. The 1 MCP has been applied within 7 days of harvest, and then we stored it at -0.5 and at 1 degrees. We've seen in the 2018 season, if we stored it at -0.5 with the application of 1 MCP, the fruit didn't ripen during shelf life. So we decided to store it at a higher temperature to sort of make sure that the fruit does ripen at the end. The next 2 treatments were a DCA treatment and also a DCA plus 1 MCP treatment. In this case, the 1 MCP was applied just before packing, in other words, pre-shipment. And the last 2 treatments was 1 MCP in combination with RA, again at the 2 temperatures, since we've seen in the previous year that there were difficulty with ripening at the -0.5 degrees temperature. Then we did fruit quality evaluations after 4 and 6 months, followed by a 6-week shipping period in normal regular atmosphere with a 7-day shelf life at 20 degrees. Okay, this is just a list of all the parameters that we looked at. We, of course, looked at fruit quality parameters of TSS, GI, firmness, and skin color, and then also assessed all the physiological disorders, especially looking at the superficial scald and the soft scald, but we also looked at internal defects as well. We did a sensory evaluation, especially with regards to texture was important for us since we've applied 1 MCP. So the first set of data that I'm going to discuss is for the optimum harvested fruit, which came from Cripps. This is the skin color data. Here I just want to emphasize that the DCA and the DCA plus 1 MCP treatment were able to retain the green color the best. With this optimum harvested fruit, we didn't get any superficial scald or soft scald even after 6 months. So there were no physiological disorders observed at any of these treatments. The next slide shows the firmness data. In the case we applied 1 MCP in combination with controlled atmosphere, the fruit didn't ripen after 4 or after 6 months of storage. However, the DCA and the DCA plus 1 MCP after both periods, the fruit did ripen to levels of approximately 2 kilograms, which is edible. When you applied 1 MCP in combination with RA, after 4 months, the firmness was still very high, especially when it was stored at -0.5, but after 6 months, it was also below 2 kilograms. The next few slides shows the post-optimum harvested fruit from Cripps. This is the superficial scald percentage that was observed. After 4 months, none of the treatments had any superficial scald incidence. However, after the 6 month period, it was only the treatments that had application of 1 MCP just after within 7 days of harvest that didn't have any superficial scald. The treatments here that had superficial scald also had, the soft scald also developed at the controlled atmosphere at 1.5, and some of the pears also had internal browning symptoms after 6 months. This is the firmness data. We see the same sort of trend that we see with the optimum harvested fruit. When 1 MCP is being applied within 7 days, the fruit didn't ripen after 4 or 6 months. The same was seen for the 1 MCP plus RA at -0.5. But if we had 1 MCP plus aura and we stored it at 1 degrees, we did get a significant drop in firmness after 6 months, but it's still at very high levels of about 4.5 kilogram. But if we look at the controlled atmosphere at 1.5, and the 2 DCA treatments, all of them had firmness levels of plus minus 2 kilograms. But there was no significant differences between the 2 DCA treatments. So the 1 MCP application just before packing didn't make any difference in the case of Abate. Okay, the next few slides is the optimum harvested fruit that came from Ceres. Here the firmness again, we didn't see any significant drop in firmness. This 1 MCP plus CAA at 1.5 did have a significant drop when compared between 4 and 6 months, but again the levels were still very high. And the 2 DCA treatments as well as a controlled atmosphere at 1.5 at lower levels of firmness below 2 kilogram, meaning that it was at a ready-to-eat stage. And again, the 1 MCP plus aura at 1 degree after 4 and after 6 months, it was at the edible stage. This shows the soft scald percentage that was observed. After 4 months, the controlled atmosphere at 1.5 as well as the DCA treatment already had soft scald issues, which obviously escalated through to the 6 months period. It was only the treatments where you had the 1 MCP application just after harvest where you didn't get any soft scald after 6 months. And also no superficial scald was also observed on those specific treatments as well. The post-optimum Abate Fetel, we are seeing the same trend as we see with all the other maturities and area. Those treatments having a firmness of below 2 kilogram. In this case, with the post-optimum fruit, we also had superficial scald. No superficial scald after 4 months, but after 6 months, it was only the 1 MCP plus C at 1.5 and the 1 MCP plus aura at 1 that didn't have any superficial scald incidence. It is surprising for us to see that the 1 MCP plus aura at minus 0.5 did have superficial scald, since in previous years it wasn't observed on that treatment. There was also soft scald. Again, after 4 months, didn't have any soft scald percentages. And after 6 months, again, the 1 MCP being applied at the beginning, that helped that they didn't develop any soft scald after the 6 months period. Okay, so what conclusions can currently be made? If you combine 1 MCP being applied within 7 days of harvest and you combine it with controlled atmosphere or regular atmosphere, there was no physiological disorders after 6 months, except for the post-optimum fruit from Ceres, due to that 1 MCP plus aura treatment at minus 0.5. The controlled atmosphere fruit, however, was not at a ready-to-eat stage. So depending on where you are sending your fruit, it will not be recommended. If we saw at the optimum aura fruit that they were at a ready-to-eat stage, except again for the post-optimum fruit of Ceres. The DCA and the DCA plus 1 MCP gave a lot of variable results. It was in this season, it was only effective in the Grabau area for the optimum fruit up to 6 months. We didn't see any disorders, but however, in all the other maturity levels and in the Ceres production area, we did get soft scald and superficial scald. So the question now is, okay, so how are we going to store Abate Fetel? Well, the most cost-effective option will be to apply the 1 MCP within 7 days of harvest, and then you can either store your fruit, this is now for optimum fruit, you can store it in RA at minus 0.5 or at 1 degree. And the two pictures on the right is just an indication of how the fruit looked after 6 months plus 6 weeks RA plus 7-day shelf life under RA with 1 MCP. So I just want to thank the ARC and Hortgro Science for funding of this project, and of course my technical assistants in the lab for doing all these maturity and quality parameters. And as soon as we've wrapped up the final report in February, we'll be giving a clear guideline of what we've seen in the past. I think it's about 5 years. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Anel. Abate Fetel remains a difficult cultivar. Nevertheless, we look forward to your final report early next year. Let's see if there are any questions. No questions. Okay, thank you, Anel.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Let's move on to our next presenter. That will be Professor Wiehann Steyn of Hortgro, looking at research priorities for the CA group.
Thank you, Richard. Can you just nod your head if you can hear me? Okay, good, thank you. I'll just share my screen quickly. Okay, you should all be able to see it now.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just, okay, slideshow. Richard, first of all, thank you very much on behalf of Hortgro for you and your team putting together this very nice program. I think it nicely showcased some of the good research we're funding in the industry. Just for all the delegates here, I want to mention that we'll be collaborating with Richard and his team again in putting together a post-harvest symposium maybe sometime next year. But more info on that at a later stage. You're of course welcome to suggest potential themes or topics for presentation at the symposium. Okay, I'm going to speak a little bit more broadly on the Hortgro post-harvest pome fruit research program, but I'll come back and end off with more specifically CA. So it's important, yeah, just in terms of the content briefly, just a little bit of Hortgro background, post-harvest research objectives, and then post-harvest research needs. I think it's important that one just keep in mind what's the main reason why we fund research at Hortgro. It's to enable our growers to stay competitive and to stay in business. So that's why we're spending the bucks on post-harvest research. In terms of the research, what are we trying to achieve? We're addressing present and future challenges by providing a constant stream of well-trained people. That's very important. You've seen 2 of the students presenting. Developing technology, so that's solutions to your problems, and then obviously creating knowledge that often don't immediately result in a solution, but over time will potentially have major spin-offs. Okay, in terms of post-harvest research objectives, it's the following. We try to provide a safe product of reliable, good quality. We want to reduce wastage and losses from defects and pathogens. We want to increase efficiencies throughout the post-harvest value chain. We want to increase sustainability of post-harvest practices. And we want to reduce risk within the post-harvest value chain, to ourselves and to the consumer, of course. The slideshow will be available later on, so if I go a bit fast, I've got 10 minutes, you'll be able to look at it again. And it's also all these info is summarized within our annual report, which is also available from the Hortgro Science website. In fact, there's abstract available for each and every project that we fund on the website that you can also access. Okay, in terms of funding allocation, the real importance of post-harvest, I think, is quite clear from this slide. 43% of all pome fruit research funding goes towards post-harvest research, with the rest split between crop production and crop protection and market access. So this is a real important focus area for Hortgro, and we fund quite a significant amount of work in the post-harvest field. It's important, of course, that the research is relevant, that we don't miss the target, that we think we're doing a good job, and meanwhile, the clients who we work don't think the same. So we make use of work groups around a themed approach to identify the most important research needs that we should be targeting. And of course, it's a bit more longer term. As you can imagine, we don't address whatever is issue in a particular year. We look at the real big issues that runs over a long time or will potentially become a big issue in the future. So looking at the different themes, I'm just quickly running through them. So we've got 4 themes of research in post-harvest research. The first one is quality management. Here we look at moisturized shrivel, edible coatings. We're looking at FEMA, for early marketing access program. We've been doing quite a bit of work on that. Drawing maybe a bit to a close now. Water deficit impact on quality, storability, ethylene management, maintenance of green color, that's particularly important on your green varieties, of course, and then CO2 sensitivity and storage and ripening protocols. I'm not going to go into detail, just giving you a broad overview of what we're funding. Then another very important theme for us is physiological defects, and here, this is where we probably delve in a bit more into the physiology of what actually causes the defect. Internal browning, you've heard the talk on that. Superficial scald, lentil cell disorders, textural disorders such as mealiness, also pertaining to taste and eating quality of fruit, of course. Internal heat damage, and then also the affected environment on various disorders. But this is a bit more, this is more in-depth work that we do. Obviously, there's overlap between the themes, and that's a good thing. Looking at the same problem from different sides, different approaches. Okay. Packaging and logistics, also becoming quite important. So packaging systems, high cube containers, temperature and humidity control and regulation in containers, plastic alternatives, reduction of plastic use, that's becoming a more prominent theme. It's a bit in the back burner now with COVID, but it's there to stay. And then AI, quality monitoring, that's quite a new field that we're also dabbling our feet in. And then we get to the one which is pertaining mostly to this seminar, which is storage techniques. And under storage techniques, performance evaluation of different storage equipment and techniques, and that will be your DCAs and your R losses and all those. Determine optimum storage protocol, best practice guidelines for various varieties. It fits under this theme. Evaluation of non-chemical sanitation techniques, evaluation of cooling regimes. And then if you want any more information, like I've mentioned before, you can find all of it under Hortgro Science on the website. And then if there's any specific CA research needs we would like to hear from you, you can now, if you want to, send through a chat, on the chat, use the chat box and send through comments to Tia. Alternatively, you can directly mail me at that email address with any particular CA specific research needs that you feel we should be addressing and it's probably not currently looking at. We will be convening in different work groups to discuss various issues amongst other scald, internal browning and so forth. And storage obviously will be an integral part of any strategy to reduce losses to those defects. But I think if you've got specific needs in terms of CA specific research, then please do not hesitate to send us your comments and your questions or suggestions. Richard, that's all from my side. Thank you very much. I don't want to use up all the time. I think everybody's eagerly waiting to get on to the main event.
Yeah, thanks, Wiehann, for a succinct but comprehensive overview of the research process. Can we just see if there are any comments? Nothing at this, so you can send them through to Wiehann at your leisure. Let's now move on to the overseas presentations. The first one being from Niels Remmelink, who's a regular visitor to our shores, except perhaps in the last period. Niels, if you want to share your screen and jump straight into your in control with my fruit.
Yes, here I am. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, I hope everybody can see the screen and can hear me clearly.
Yeah, you can see the screen and hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. First, thank you for inviting me to join this webinar. As we have heard in the previous presentations, yeah, it's very important to control the temperature and, of course, oxygen and CO2. So I will explain a little bit more in this presentation about our MyFood system. That is of course the management system to control the oxygen, CO2, and also temperature, water loss measurement, and humidification. Actually, we see the MyFood system as a management system that can control your whole CA facility. So the CA equipment, cooling, of course monitoring, so remote control, and also the backup of your data. So all registration of your valuable data like oxygen values, CO2 values, temperatures. And of course, also it's possible to control your dynamic system that I will explain later on. So more about that system. First of all, we are able to control, of course, the nitrogen generators, the CO2 absorbers, PSA nitrogen generators, and if needed, also the ethylene converters. All is controlled by the MyFood system, and also alarms, everything will be controlled by MyFood. So the operator can do everything behind his computer or behind the MyFood cabinet, and he will receive alarms and has a total overview and one user system to control his whole CA facility. Of course, we have all the registration of the data for the oxygen, CO2, and also temperature. It's also important for when people export foods. They have to show the buyers where they export to show the temperature registration, the CO2 registration, oxygen registration, and that's all included in the system. Next to the standard CA control, of course, we can also control different kind of cooling systems. Of course, for South Africa, we do that together with our partner over there, ARE. So together with them, they build the cooling systems, and we control them partly with our MyFood system at room level. And it's even possible to control different kind of cooling systems and on different levels. So we can do only temperature registration, we can do temperature control on room level, and we can even control the machine room if needed, all with one system. Here we have an overview of an example. This is an example of a floor plan of all your cold rooms or CA rooms. So we can see the temperatures, CO2, oxygen levels, overview of your machinery. And if we have a machine room control, we even can show also the accurate conditions of your machine room, like the compressors, condenser, heat exchangers. So all is possible to have it in your floor plan and to see in one overview what's going on with the system. For the cooling for the CA rooms, of course, it's important to have your temperature sensors. When we don't control the rooms at cooling control, but only have product sensors, it's of course important to have a product sensor on your coldest spot and your warmest spot. That's even when we don't control the cooling, we like to have two temperature sensors to see what's going on in the room, because temperature is number one. If we don't control, if the temperature is not controlled well, then CA will also have no benefit. So temperature is number one. So that's why it's very important to monitor your temperature, and especially on different spots in your cold room. Next to that, of course, it's important to monitor your action of cooling, the circulation, and water loss, because all this data is important for the quality of your foods. If we have too much cooling actions or we have too much water loss, it will have effect on your food quality. So the more information we can get from your room, from your cold room, the better it's for the food quality of the product. Because if we can monitor all these parameters, we are still able to change settings to have the optimum storage conditions and the optimum settings for your CA installation. this is an example how we do the cooling control mostly in South Africa together with ARE. So we can control the cooling, and we also do the defrosting automatically, also important. And we have the spikes, the product sensors. So enough temperature sensors to do the complete cooling control in the CA room, and yeah, to have fully grip on what we are doing with with the temperatures. As I said, defrosting is very important to do automatic defrosting, because when you defrost too late or too early, it will also have influence on your cooling results. So, and when we do it with automatic system, you always will have defrost on the right time and not too late or too early. Defrosting we can do on different ways, so electrical with fan heat or with warm glycol or hot gas, depending on what kind of cooling system is available. And we do it with temperature sensor inside the cooling, or we can do it on interval, so depending on the cooling installation. And of course, this picture is an extreme example of ice climbing, but when you never defrost, you will at the end you will have this kind of result. Then the other thing that's very important, I'm happy to see, I see it more and more in South Africa now, the water loss measurement. In Europe, it's for many years it's already very important to measure your water loss, because this tells you a lot of what's happening in your culture. Because if we lose too much water, it means we are losing weight from our fruits. And if we're losing too much weight, at the end, the weight of the fruit is also kilograms, and the kilograms are also it's also euros and money at the end of the storage period. So it's important to see and to measure how many water we lost from the fruits. And we do that with automatic water loss measurement. And this water loss measurement tells us actually if the cooling is adjusted well, if the running hours are okay, if the defrosting hours are okay. So it really gives you a lot of information. And especially for sensitive products that have sensitive skin for drying out, it's important that we don't dry out too much the fruit. So the water loss gives us an indication if we are on the right level. And because we start measuring from the beginning, we are still able to change settings to get on the right water loss level. So I know here in Holland, Wiehann University is providing information for different kinds of fruits, apples, pears, how much water they are allowed to lose for each 100 ton. So the CA operator knows, oh, I'm allowed to lose this amount of water, and if I too high, I have to change cooling settings, or I have to do something to get to that target level of water loss. Are they too low? Because sometimes they are too low with water loss. Some kind of apples, it's important to have a little bit water loss. Then they also know I'm too low with the water loss level. I need to go up a little bit. So it tells you a lot of information how your CA and cooling is running, and if you are running well, and if everything is adjusted well. And next to that, if it's needed, it's possible also to do some prevents of water loss, like pre-cooling and wetting of bins. So, because if you have wooden bins, a dry wooden bin will already absorb some water loss. So if the bin is already a little bit wet, you don't have this absorption of from the fruits. Of course, the packaging, and also possibility is to add humidification. So then you are also allowed, you have the option to add some humidification, some water, to keep it on the right level. Humidification, especially here in Holland, is used for the conference pear. That's very sensitive because of the thin neck for drying out. So then they also adjust some water loss to keep the moisture loss of the fruits as low as possible. Of course, it's important that the system is remotely accessible. So every system that is connected with internet, we can remote from TeamViewer from every computer or tablet. And next to that, we have last month we have updated our MyFruit app to receive push-ups for alarms and to have a quick overview of your oxygen and CO2 and temperature levels. So actually, yeah, you have on your phone, you have the quick overview and you have the alarm reports. And with TeamViewer, we are always able to support the systems and to change settings if needed. Then I will tell a little bit more about the ACR in practice. Bram also explained a little bit in the previous presentations. I will also explain a little bit more. Maybe there are some questions at the end, and I will also answer them. Yeah, what was already explained, why we want dynamic CA, because mainly we want to fight scald, and DPA has banned, so we have to find alternatives. And also, of course, to retain the quality after storage. And in some cases, it's also to save energy. We have some examples here in Holland that we see that with such low oxygen levels, there are less cooling actions, less CO2 absorption actions. So they see also the energy consumption is going down because of the low oxygen level, low respiration rates, and less heat production. So it also has an effect on the energy consumption. What is ACR? ACR, Advanced Control of Respiration, and the main goal is to store automatically. And of course, what Bram also explained, we want to reach the lowest possible oxygen level. And we do that by measuring the respiration and to determine the RQ levels. Why we want to determine the RQ levels? Because we have seen RQ is early warning. So we see RQ levels are rising earlier than before we see any ethanol development. So when we see the RQ levels rising, we are still on time to hire the oxygen before the ethanol production will start. So to be on the safe side, we can set the RQ target levels, and before we have high RQ levels and before the ethanol production starts, we can already increase the oxygen level to prevent ethanol development. How is the RQ defined? Actually, it's the CO2 production divided by the O2 consumption, as we can see here. And as we can see, the RQ is going up. So when we're going too low in oxygen level, you will get a spike in the CO2 production. So at the spike in the CO2 production, also the RQ levels are going up. And this is actually our signal that that the RQ is rising and that oxygen levels are getting too low. So this is a signal for the MyFruit system that it has to higher the oxygen level because we are getting too low in oxygen. And the MyFruit system is doing this automatically. So when we have, for example, we have a set point of an RQ of 2 or 1.6. And when we measure RQ levels above the set point, the MyFruit system will automatically higher the oxygen set point in the room. If the RQ levels are still under the set point, the MyFruit system will lower the oxygen levels in the room automatically to find the optimum oxygen level for that room according to the set point of the RQ level. How do we define these RQ levels? Because we want to measure the oxygen consumption and CO2 production in a few hours, we stop the cooling because we just want to measure what the fruit is doing, and we don't want to have any influence from other activities. So we stop the cooling. MyFruit is stopped automatically. Also the CA activity, so the CO2 absorber, nitrogen generator, everything is stopped. Then the room is provided with a pressure sensor. before we start the ACR measurement, we overpressure the room a little bit. So we don't have any influence from outside to influence our measurements. So when the room is overpressured with a little bit of nitrogen, then we start, normally for 4 hours, we start measuring the oxygen consumption in the room and the CO2 production. In the 4 hours, we do, for example, 7 measurements, and the measurements will be shown in a graph, and that will calculate the RQ of this measurement. After the calculation, then the O2 level, the new O2 set point will be automatically adjusted by the system. For example, here we see these measurements. This is, for example, was an example by University of Stellenbosch. What Bram also said, because it's for quite small containers, and how smaller the volume, how more sensitive they are for a small leak. Like big commercial CA rooms, they're quite big, so then we don't have this this influence. But a small container, if there even was a small leak at the plastic cover, it will influence the measurement. But by big commercial rooms, we don't have this this case, because we have a little bit overpressure and it's much bigger volume, so we don't have the influence of oxygen from outside. What we also do, what do we require? We do the measurements with a special oxygen analyzer, because we go quite low in oxygen. We don't use an oxygen analyzer from 0 till 25%. No, we use below the 2.5%. We have a double scale analyzer. Then we go from 0 to 2.5% oxygen to have precise measurements, because we are so low in this oxygen level. We need a very accurate analyzer. So the system will automatically switch to the low scale when it's below the 2.5 oxygen. And to be sure that the right measurement is done, we will do a multi-point calibration. So we calibrate on 0% oxygen and we calibrate on 1% oxygen. So we are 100% sure that the measurements between 0 and 1% oxygen is okay. And an extra safety is also, we measure at 2 points in the CA room. So we measure in the front and we measure in the back of the CA room. And the system is automatically comparing these two measurements. Is that if there's too much difference, then the system says this is too much difference in oxygen level, and the ACR run will be ignored, because it's not, it should be at the same oxygen level in the front of the room and in the back of the room. If that's the same oxygen level and all measurements are okay, then you will get a green end result. The system is calculating the RQ level and decides to go up or go down with the oxygen, new oxygen target level. And all this is done in the ACR software module. Because it needs some information to get the RQ target level, and before we start with dynamic control, we first have the normal CA control, and we have this kind of protocols. With these protocols, we show the people how they can start from the beginning to the start of the dynamic storage, step by step, how to control the oxygen, the temperature, and CO2 levels. This is an example. Together with ARE, we still fine-tuning and updating these protocols. I know Lordy from ARE contacted us last week. They had very good results with Peckham pears and Forel, also stored with the dynamic CA. And with this information, we update our protocols again, and Lordy can share them again with the customer, so they know for next season how to store this pears again under dynamic ACR. And if it's known, also information about water laws and other information is shown in this protocols. That was actually my presentation for now. There's a longer version, but we don't have all the time to explain all the sheets in this version, so I shared it with Richard, and it's available on the web link. And probably people have questions, they can ask me, or can ask me at the end of the presentation. And for the last thing, I want to tell you that for South Africa projects, we work together with AOE. And yeah, if there are any questions or local information needed, it's also possible to contact AOE. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Niels. Let's just see if there are any questions. Doesn't look like it. No, so thank you, Niels. Let's move on now to the last presentation, and that is by Adjunct Professor Robert Prange of Faculty of Agriculture, Dalhousie University, Canada. I'm proud to call Bob my friend. He's visited us, I think, twice. And we're actually privileged to get this presentation, which formed part of his presentation at the, or would have formed part of the presentation at the CA Congress, which could not be held earlier this year in Belgium. So, welcome, Bob, and we look forward to your presentation. Oh, unmute, Bob.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, now we can hear you. Great.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see you.
Thank you very much. I'll just try to get to the beginning of the slide here. Greetings to everyone from Nova Scotia, and I'd like to say a few thank yous to my colleague Andrew Brink at Gasset Site, and of course Richard Herndal. Thank you for inviting me. An acknowledgement to my colleague Dr. Barbara Daniels-Lake. She helped me with some of the graphical and editorial assistance on this presentation. And as Richard has come to find out, I've been dabbling in various aspects of what's going on with CA storage, temperature, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. So the presentation today is only on the carbon dioxide component and only on apple and pear storage, no other fruits. There have been no recent breakthroughs in reliable methods to determine the acceptable CO2 concentration. So one must rely on the indirect approach to choose the correct CO2 concentration. This presentation will examine the utility of selecting the CO2 concentration in CA as a proportion of the recommended oxygen as defined by global use. In other words, using a CO2 to oxygen ratio. I'll start with a real world example that will hopefully focus the issue. Here's an example. It's April of 2019. These apples came out of a storeroom, and you can see obvious problems in the photograph there. It's CO2 damage. It's golden delicious. And this is, you know, an issue that forces one to look into the data set of temperature and CO2 and oxygen and to find out what caused the problem, especially when you see that in the data set here. I'm trying to move my cursor. I'm not sure what's going on. There it is there. There's a storeroom with a disorder and the storeroom with none. And I was frustrated in trying to figure out why there was this CO2 damage. Finally, focused on calculating the ratio of the CO2 and oxygen in the room. And I looked at the fact that, and I think there's some mention of it already in previous presentations, rapid cool down. So there was very fast cooling to less than 1 degree Celsius in this room. but more importantly, inside the red circle, the ratio of CO2 to oxygen suddenly jumped up to a 4.50. In my opinion, that what forced me to start thinking more seriously about using that ratio as opposed to the absolute temperature or absolute oxygen or absolute CO2 in such situations. So that was part of the genesis for me looking at how to deal with carbon dioxide in CA stores. And I may come back to that later on in the presentation, but keep this in mind as I go through. So another thing that I want everyone to know is that the last summary of CA storage recommendations for apples and pears was a long time ago, almost 20 years ago. It was at the 8th International CA Conference in 2001 by my colleague Gene Kupferman. And you can find that summary as listed there, Acta Horticulturae, published in 2003. This was part of a tradition that stopped after that. So that's pretty well the last summary of CO2 recommendations as well as oxygen and temperatures for various apples and pears around the world. The other point I want to make is that the concept of CO2 and oxygen has been accepted in a general sense, but it's never been well defined. And for instance, amongst many examples, but I'll just show you one there, Gene Kupferman in that presentation simply says in CO2 intolerant cultivars, the CO2 should remain well below the oxygen at all times. My opinion, that's not very helpful, but that's pretty well what we find in the literature is next to nothing on how to set a carbon dioxide level in the CA storeroom. So I'm now going to identify at least the following factors that we have to think about. There may be others, but this is the ones that I'll present in this presentation. The first is the cultivar. CO2 tolerance rating of apple and pear cultivars has been based on opinion rather than scientific testing. Again, using the benchmark paper of Kupferman. Using Washington state varieties, this is in the US, he says CO2 tolerant varieties would be Gala and Golden Delicious. Somewhat CO2 tolerant would be the Red Delicious and its clones that come out in various names, not just as Red Delicious, but I think you have them named by their clone in South Africa. And then the last group are the CO2 intolerant, and he names Fuji, Braeburn, and Rome. Now that's 2001 vintage. As we all know, there's been a lot of new apple varieties that have come on the market. And that information that was, say, 2000 is kind of stale dated. But let's just go with what he has attempted to identify there and see if I can add more information on cultivar effects. Now, in addition to the cultivar, I've identified a few other factors that may affect the tolerance to CO2. They are in order of what you see on the screen: storage temperature, time, that means time within the storage period, early versus late storage period, as oxygen concentration in the storeroom. And the final factor I'll talk about today is the presence of MCP in the storeroom. Okay, that first item was temperature. Temperatures that can cause chilling injury, and I'll loosely define that as less than 1 degree Celsius, seem to cause more CO2 associated disorders. That's repeatedly mentioned specifically or referenced in all kinds of articles on CA storage of apples and pears. The next point was time. There's more low temperature induced CO2 damage, defined as a high CO2 and oxygen ratio, at the beginning of storage. And that's where I put an underline. See the example I just gave you in the introduction. That was a bad combination. The presence of that high CO2 ratio so early in the storage period was its undoing, in my opinion. Okay, third item, oxygen concentration. There is a general consensus that reducing the oxygen concentration increases the propensity for CO2 damage, and therefore one must drop the CO2 when the oxygen is lowered, implying therefore the need to maintain a specific CO2 to oxygen ratio. So there is an implication in that philosophy that that ratio is relevant. So here I'll give you an example, and you can go, I can go into the literature, and you could too, and you could find this historical trend. This one is Bramley sealing. That first value is from the 1930s. It's actually still recommended in the UK at that combination. So it's an oxygen of 11 to 12%. And look at the CO2, it's 9 to 10%. They since learned they could drop it to 2%, but then they had to drop the CO2 to 6%. And then they got more bold and they dropped it to 1%, and they dropped it to 5%. That's just one recommendation out of many, many historical recommendations where you'll see as the oxygen has been dropped over the decades, the CO2 recommendations have been dropped concomitantly. Now, in the last, since 2000, we've embarked not only into a 1 MCP usage, but this new technology, the DCA type of technology, which is typically getting us commercially into less than 1% oxygen. In adopting DCA, the researchers in the industry have assumed in DCA that just by the point above that there should be a further proportional lowering of the CO2 concentration. But this has never been extensively studied. It's just been based by extension of the experience under those higher oxygens. Okay, 1 MCP. When it first came on the market and became used slightly after 2000, the year 2000, there was a whole host of complaints from packing houses, and that's when they came to realize that MCP can increase CO2-induced disorders in CA. So with that background, I'm going to explain to you what data I am using in the rest of the presentation. I'm using information in a database I've compiled from published and unpublished sources between the year 2000 and today, including the information documented in Kupferman 2003. So I'm not using anything from the year years prior to 2000. And there may be some value, but for the purposes of my database, I'm not including that. At the moment, I have in that database from around the world about 116 apple and 41 European and Asian pear cultivars. From around 16 as of last week, I've added another region. So it's a living document, and I'm adding week by week. In each recommendation that I have deposited in the database, I've documented the cultivar, the region, the year, the optimum RA storage temperature, the optimum CA storage temperature, the oxygen concentration, the CO2 concentration, storage duration, and notes. Not every recommendation has all that information, but a large number of them do. So I've mined that data set, and from that, I will now talk about just the information relevant to carbon dioxide. So I determined the mean oxygen and mean CO2 recommendations for each cultivar. I calculated the ratio of CO2 to oxygen using the mean CO2 and mean oxygen, and I will present them in the following separate tables. What I learned from that is that the cultivars can be arranged in order from highest to lowest CO2 oxygen ratio, and I've divided them into 7 categories based on this ratio. So I will show you, name them here, and you will see from group 1 to 7, I'm going lower in that ratio value. Group 1 would be cultivars that have a very high CO2 tolerance. They had a ratio of 1.5 or more. And you can see progressing down what I call a moderately high CO2 tolerance, a slightly high, medium, moderately low, very low CO2 tolerance, and finally group 7 is extremely low CO2 tolerance. Okay, so I generated, by the way, I apologize about my cat here. He's getting friendly, wanting to get into the show. So we have a grouping up of 7 different categories of ratio. I will not show you all of them, all the varieties in all the groups. I've learned apparently that you have a list of the major varieties of apples in South Africa. So I'm focusing just now out of that data set on the varieties of apples I believe are the major apple varieties you produce and store in South Africa. So leading the list in group 1, there is one variety of apple, the Golden Delicious, that has very high CO2 tolerance. And its ratio is a 1.6. The number of records is 39. So that means these are the number of records from around the world of recommendations for Golden Delicious, from which I could get the CO2, the oxygen, and the temperature. These are recommendations. They're not numbers I generated. It's just commercial recommendations. Interestingly, in the example I gave to you in the introduction, it was Golden Delicious that showed the CO2 problem. So even your Golden Delicious variety that's probably the most tolerant of CO2 can succumb to CO2 damage, in my opinion, if you get the ratio wrong at some point in the storage period, especially at the beginning. In the second group, South Africa grows 2 varieties in that group, Gala and Red Delicious. And I'll make a point here at this stage that the genetics of the variety can help you understand what the ratio could be. For instance, Gala is half Golden Delicious. So it's not surprising that it has somewhat similar tolerance to CO2 that the Golden Delicious has. And you'll see the ratios down to 1.3 for both of those. Dropping in CO2 tolerance, we're now below 1. We're in the group 4 category. We have Granny Smith. The calculation of 24 records around the world shows it's right on 1.0. Cripps Pink, it's just below that. You have Kanzi, I guess is the commercial name. You can see the number of records are dropping, so the reliability now gets a bit less. Cripps Red, I believe you grow with only 5 records from around the world on that. Excuse me, and Kanzi is a cross between Braeburn and I believe Gala. So you can see it's kind of in between what you have for Gala, and then you see Braeburn showing in that last list with low CO2 tolerance along with Fuji. Okay, so moving on to pears, and again, I want to caution, number of records is important. Unfortunately, with pears, there's always fewer records than apples, so the reliability drops with the numbers you see here. And also the CO2 oxygen ratio for pear varieties is invariably less than for apple varieties. So in the list of pear varieties, Packham's is probably the most tolerant at a 1.2. The next group is Farrell and Bosque. And I only have 2 records for Rosemary, which I believe you produced there. So it's a rather weak number. I put it in brackets for that reason. And of course, Williams or Bartlett is in that as one of the varieties you grow in South Africa. And you've had a presentation on Abate Fetel. Guess what? It has a very low CO2 tolerance, which is not surprising when you actually see it not liking CA in general. Prefers air. All right. I'm going to show you some slides of how the storage oxygen may, and I'll say may, influence the recommended CO2. Okay. In the first graph there is Golden Delicious. So you see every data point of Golden Delicious recommendations from around the world. I've plotted in blue that ratio, which should be with 1T, by the way, should be 1.60. That came from what I showed you earlier. So if that's true as a number that is reliable at all oxygens, all the data should be scattered close to that blue line. However, you can see going down below, I'll say roughly 1% and lower, the recommended values are actually sliding a bit above that ratio. And at the other side, above 2.5 and up to 3, you see a number of recommendations that are below that number. So it's suggesting that you can let the ratio go higher in some varieties, like Golden Delicious, above the calculated value of 1.6 if you are going down into DCA regimes. I'm saying suggest, okay? Now, does that apply to all, does that apply to all varieties? Well, not necessarily so. Here's Ida Red. The ratio is 1.33, and you look at the scatter, it's pretty well close to the line, regardless of oxygen. Going down in ratio to Gala, again, you'll see the mean is 1.3, but that is, in red circle, data points below that. And when you get down to oxygens less than 1 and to DCA territory, it looks like you can actually let that ratio be a bit above the calculated value. Now, Empire, popular, not so much in your country, but just to show you that, again, somewhat hinting that when you get down into DCA with Empire, the ratio values are above the calculated line. And then finally, Braeburn, very low CO2 ratio of 0.57 is the example here. It looks like, again, you can let the ratio go a bit above the calculated value when you're in DCA compared with higher oxygens. I'm not going into more detail on this. There's more information if you want. It's a free and available document I've generated in storage oxygen. And there's the website URL, and you can go and download it and read more of my thoughts on storage oxygen beyond this presentation. Now, the other factor with slides that I'll present in this presentation is storage temperature. Interesting. So we have storage temperature. The first one is the widest range of storage temperatures for Cripps Pink and Ida Red. And as I go down the slides, you'll see that storage temperature range collapse a bit, just because that's the way the storage recommendations came to me from different varieties around the world. So here's Cripps Pink. It ranges from minus 0.5, that's the blue dots, all the way up to 3.5 degrees Celsius. This is long-term storage. This is not at the beginning, but once you're into long-term storage. what do you see? Well, I put a little red arrow with the SA label. That's you guys in South Africa. You're on the very end of the temperature range on the low side, and I'm not sure why. There must be a reason why you've adopted that. You are an outlier in the world. The other thing is, notice the dip, and I want to keep pointing that out to you. There's a dip around 1 degree Celsius, and it doesn't really start climbing until above 2 Celsius and higher. Okay, so that what it's telling me is that you'll see in the recommendation that CO2, which is the y-axis, recommendation doesn't dare, people don't dare go up in CO2 unless they are above 2 degrees Celsius. And it seems to be that way. There seems to be a chilling sensitivity effect that I mentioned in the introduction, that cold temperatures are connected with lower CO2 recommendations and tolerances. So it's showing up in the recommendations from around the world for, in this case, Cripps Pink and Ida Reds there. Now, in the lower graph, these are varieties you don't grow, but I'm just showing you that it doesn't always hold. There's Empire above 2 Celsius. The recommendation is not for more CO2, but in Northern Spy, it goes way up to 8%. Here's two more of temperature effect on CO2 recommendation. Gala, it seems, again, notice I'm collapsing down the temperature scale just because that's the temperature range in the recommendations from around the world for Gala. I only got up to a recommendation of 3 degrees, so there's not much on the right side. I can't put too much meaning in this slide of Gala, but again, South Africa is an outlier on the left. And Fuji and Golden Delicious. So Golden Delicious in the gold color. And again, once you get above 2 Celsius, then some people are recommending a bit higher CO2. Now that's a very loose interpretation, and with regard to Fuji, not so much. The recommendation is regardless of the temperature in that slide, the CO2 is always low. That's probably because it's very CO2 sensitive. And Braeburn, also CO2 sensitive. Again, I'm a victim of what recommendations I'm able to get. You can see that the range now is just not even up to 2 Celsius in recommendations, and in Delicious it's even lower. So there's not much one can conclude from that, but certainly again, South Africa is consistently low in its storage recommendation. And I would throw out the question in your research whether you should be exploring higher storage temperatures, and if you do, try going above 2 Celsius and see if you can allow the CO2 to go up in the varieties of your choice. And again, I have more information on storage temperature at the website there, in which I identify what I call the chilling sensitive varieties, which are always stored above 1 Celsius, and the varieties that are chilling tolerant that can be stored at less than 1. Okay, now 1 MCP and its effect on CO2 and oxygen. This table is a first approximation based on a very small number, and I want to keep saying that, small number of recommendations that include both a CA recommendation without MCP, that would be a CA only recommendation, and a CA recommendation if MCP is applied. And I would say before CA starts, because I believe in some jurisdictions, there are people actually now adding MCP later on after CA is started or even before the stores are opened. So looking at what I've been able to extract, and of course it's a a mixture of varieties of apples. Some are in your areas, some are not. I've calculated the CO2 oxygen ratio, CA only, same ratio when there's MCP involved, and taking that MCP value and looking at it as a percentage of the CA only. And once your eyes go down to the mean at the bottom and it says 42%, that means if you've added MCP into your CA regime, that value is the average drop in your ratio that you should consider. In other words, you've got to drop the carbon dioxide compared with CA only. So here are my final thoughts. Of course, if there's no history of CO2 damage, stay the course. Do not consider any changes. If there's a history of CO2 damage, and it could be the external, like I showed you at the beginning, or some internal damage, I think you saw some in Pink Lady, the cavities that can show up in the flesh. Consider one or more of the following, and all of these bullets have in some way been adopted in various varieties in various regions around the world. So it's not first time for me to suggest these things. Consider scrubbing carbon dioxide during loading and cooling. And of course, the two main technologies are the activated carbon and or lime for scrubbing. Consider, in the second bullet, continuing that CO2 scrubbing during the oxygen pull down. And then when you begin the control atmosphere phase, control CO2 levels according to the ratio for a specific cultivar. And I've given you some fixed numbers for your South African varieties. If you're utilizing the DCA, which roughly is less than 1%, as I mentioned earlier, there is evidence that ratio can be higher than in the standard CA of probably over 1%, but this needs to be validated by your R&D people. And finally, if MCP is applied before CA, delay your CA, and that delay varies. It can be perhaps to 2 weeks before you should start the CA pull down, and or reduce the ratio in CA2. And I'm just using a 50% number. Again, you might find that you need to refine that with your own R&D expertise. And I must compliment everyone that I've listened to. You've got quite a team in South Africa, and I'm sure that your industry is on top of everything because of that expertise in your institutes. And that ends my presentation.
Thank you, Bob, for a very thought-provoking presentation. It certainly has given us some food for thought. Let's see if there are any questions. Not yet. Perhaps I can mention one of the reasons why we use the low storage temperatures is that we have to export to the Northern Hemisphere, and that sometimes takes a month or two in regular atmosphere before the product is eaten. So people tend to err on the colder side to maintain the quality for the export situation. Is there anyone else who would like to comment on that? Henk, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, the low temperatures that we export in was basically, that's work that was done in the 60s. And we've never changed. We adopted the very early American models, and which means bring down cool as cold as possible. And then on our normal varieties, which were the goldens and reds and grannies those days, were -0.5. Although we shipped early grannies at 5 in the beginning, and then we sort of forgot about that. But the pink ladies and all the new varieties are basically now scented 1. Yes, there are some steady markets which we try and change, because we have to be under steady conditions for many countries, where you have to be below 2.4 fruit temperature for a period of 14 days. So that forces us normally to go lower. And secondly is pressure is everything. That's why, I mean, we're marginal pressure most of the time. So we try and do everything to not to arrive with a specific set temperature by a specific client. So that was the other reason why we go cold. But I think the pink lady one was, I looked at the pictures and it was said we had -0.5, but we never, nobody stores pink lady at -0.5 anymore. You just cause damage.
Thank you, made a comment. Sorry, Bob.
Yeah. A couple of other comments I maybe can make on temperature. It's showing me that somewhere around 2 Celsius and below, and certainly by 1 Celsius and below, there's something going on with CO2. And I want to point out a couple of things that not too many people know or mention. The first thing is that carbon dioxide in physical terms is more soluble in a liquid phase at colder temperatures. The other thing that is in the literature but not studied well enough is that, and this came out of work in the 1960s from the group in the UK, as you drop temperature, the RQ goes up dramatically. Now, to me, that means that when you get into that chilling sensitivity range of, say, 1 Celsius as an example, an RQ going up means that it's triggering anaerobic respiration just based on cold temperature. And is that, I'm just posing a question for thought, is that another factor in why, you know, we've learned to keep our CO2 down at those cold temperatures, and we can relax the CO2 maybe by at a slightly higher temperature, and maybe even save some energy costs as well. But I just wanted to say that there is evidence that the RQ goes up dramatically, and also that CO2 is more soluble in liquid phase at colder temperatures. That was something I just mentioning in passing. And also, by the way, RQ goes up if you measure it in a CO2-free headspace. That's just a measurement artifact, I suppose, but it tends to have a higher value if your CO2 in the headspace is lower to begin with. But back to the temperature, there's a combination of cold temperature and CO2 that's bad. And with regard to Pink Lady, the growing conditions seem to be a big factor in Australia, that they really focused on growing degree days, and that if you have a cool growing condition, low growing degree day values, you have to watch your storage temperature. That is, it's more sensitive to low temperature disorders. Again, that's just on the issue of temperature, and certainly -0.5 is really a dangerous place to be if you have a temperature problem disorder, such as in Pink Lady.
Okay, we've had some other questions. Elke wants to make a point. Elke, you're coming.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. I really enjoyed that. I would like also to make the point that sometimes in research we use the extremes like -0.5 degrees Celsius to point out, to use the extremes to look at factors. which play a role. So sometimes one must look a bit carefully at the publications or that research, because that doesn't mean necessarily that one stores in that manner. The other thing that we noticed is in Heleen's talk, she also measured CO2, internal CO2, and interestingly enough, like you said, when chilling injury occurs, and maybe one should expect this, the CO2 level was higher, the ripening rate was higher, so that chilling injury actually causes faster senescence, and we see that in everything. So I agree with you that cold temperature and it might, the CO2 in this instance might be a result of the chilling injury rather than maybe the external CO2 in that instance. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elke. Just a number of other questions and comments. Henk also added that we see a lot of CO2 damage on Fuji. We scrub all lime and CO2 concentrations are low, so we get damage in spite of that. And he added that the defect is manifested as browning inside the upper cheek of the fruit. Then we've also had a question during 24-hour 1 MCP treatment, there can be a buildup of CO2 in the rib as high as 3 to 5%. Can that cause CO2 damage?
Okay, I'll try. I think what I heard as the second question was when you apply MCP, you see a CO2 increase?
Yeah, 3 to 5%.
Yes. That's interesting because many years ago, not many years, we were playing with adding MCP on apples, and we were using our chlorophyll fluorescence, and we saw a spike in our CF value when we added the MCP, and it calmed down. And when we looked, we went and then looked at the CO2 production, and guess what? CO2 production goes up. There's a kind of a stress respiration response to the application of 1 MCP. So the fluorescence value spiking temporarily was telling us that there was actual respiration spike when you add MCP. So that is a real phenomenon, in my opinion, what that person has just said, that there is a CO2 spike and you'd better have some way to scrub it out when you add the MCP.
Added to that question, Bob, was during the 1 MCP treatment, fruit is sometimes still warmish at 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. Would that be a problem?
Oh boy, I hesitate to get into the MCP world because I'm not deeply knowledgeable of MCP. But as I understand it, MCP can be applied at warmer temperatures, but let's remember the basic physiology is that at warmer temperatures, the respiration goes up. And so whatever CO2 production may be at a cold temperature, it will be higher at a warmer temperature. So if you're doing that, again, you have to get that, monitor your CO2 and get ready to remove it. And certainly be careful of letting the oxygen go down, because then you're ending up with a bad CO2 to oxygen ratio that's really going to magnify the problem, just like I showed you at the beginning. And that was, those Golden Delicious didn't have any MCP on it. Well, add in MCP and it's probably going to be a real mess at 10 Celsius if you aren't monitoring that CO2 and oxygen and making sure you don't get on the wrong side of the values for oxygen and CO2.
Thank you. If there are any more questions, please just unmute and raise your question.
Okay, I have another question, if that's okay, Richard. Alke. Okay, I would like to know, DCA, CF, we've been testing all sorts of low CA regimes on Granny Smith for school development. And we measured reactive oxygen species. Why is it that DCA, CF treatments always have the highest reactive oxygen species measurements, and yet they never show scald?
I cannot answer that question. I don't know. I'll try and not answer. I cannot give you the answer to your question, Elka, but please remember that, and I showed that if you look at that document, I gave the URL, it's on storage oxygen. In the literature, and I quote, there's actually other articles I've been able to add to, but as you drop the oxygen, the sensitivity, well, first off, the production of ethylene goes to zero, roughly around 0.3% oxygen or lower. Also, the sensitivity to any ethylene is also going to roughly zero when you get down to that 0.3, 0.4. And so if the reactive oxygen species are there, they may not, I'm just trying to make a general statement that generally the ethylene activity is also dropped in the very low oxygen. Well, whatever means you happen to use. Of course, I know the DCA-CF method, but there are other means, as you know. And that not only drops the ethylene production, but also the activity of ethylene. And how that affects the ROS, I'll leave it to some of your researchers to look into. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, there's also, and I mentioned that in that article, we published on it, Elka, that take a look at the xanthophyll cycle. That's very important in the protection of the fruit. Okay. Zeaxanthin, phytoxanthin.
Yeah, I think that's involved. I do also think that.
Okay.
I have another question, a quick one, sorry. We always see ethylene rising after certain months of storage, low oxygen storage at 0.4% oxygen. What ethylene cycle has ethylene production at such a low oxygen level?
So yes, over the many months, you're saying you see it gradually going up, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Well, if you take a look at the literature, it's wonderful sometimes reading some of these articles that are there. You'll see that once we put fruit into CA store, if it's not already climacteric, it will try to go through the climacteric once it's in the CA storage regime. Well, at lower oxygen, it happens at a very, very, very slow rate, but it will eventually do its climacteric. It may take months instead of days, but it will do it. And that is probably what you're seeing, is that it's going through a very, very slow climacteric, even at that lower oxygen. And it's possible that there's still just enough ethylene to start it. It's just going to be at a very slow rate.
Thank you.
Good. People, this is a unique opportunity. Please raise your questions. Please unmute and just raise your question. Henk and Fruitways, are you happy with the responses?
Richard, can I come in? It's Henk here.
Yeah. Go for it.
I mean, I have so many questions, I don't know where to start. That's the problem. I mean, we did a lot of things, and we see funny things. On the golden thing, it was interesting because for years we've had we sent fruit to Africa, and our traditional way of doing is packing in a plastic bag We ship at, the delivery air temperature is -1. That means fruit temperature is around about 0 to 2 degrees, because a container is not the best cooling thing that there is. At one specific grower, we started seeing that exact picture that you showed us, that brown spots on the fruit. Although it was just one producer, and it wasn't general, and it was just in Africa. So we could never understand what that happens, but it could be the ratio. I haven't looked at the ratio. We looked at the CO2, but we never focused on the ratio. We only focused on CO2. So that's an interesting thing that made me think. And on most of our apples lately, it seems that they are highly CO2 sensitive. Yeah, we had what you say about solubility of CO2 versus the moisture content. 5 years ago, we had a thunderstorm just before picking, and we had massive internal browning coupled to cavities. So I fully agree with you there that's basically what we eventually summarized happened on that stage. But what we're seeing now, especially on the New Zealand strains of the Jazz and the Envies and things like that, and we're trying, and our fruit that comes, Fujis that come from the Free State, they always have CO2 damage. And we have to follow a strict rule of bringing them down very gradually for 2 to 3 weeks before they reach temperatures which are around about 3 degrees to 1 to 3 degrees. And like we first smart fresh, and then we bring them down, no CA, very gradually. But still we see cavities forming. So that is strange. I mean, the oxygen is normal and the CO2 is atmospheric, but we see cavities forming, which I cannot. I mean, it means something inside the tissue is not actually what happens outside. Perhaps you can have an idea, because I don't know. I have no idea what goes on.
It's always difficult to do a forensic detail in a conversation. And a colleague of mine in the UK says, context is everything. There's probably other information that would be relevant to trying to come up with what caused your particular problem. There's probably, one needs to have a bit more information, I suspect. Keep in mind, I'm just going to make a general statement, and even Gene Kupferman mentioned this in his 2003 summary. We're looking at new varieties, and you've mentioned one. All these new varieties are very dense. Yeah. Well, that's great for the consumer, but it's awful for post-harvest people. It just creates, literally, and I'll try and explain what I'm about to say. You created a dense tissue in which there's less air passages. And in fact, and I've measured this on my case, Honeycrisp, I've measured anaerobic conditions of Honeycrisp still hanging on the tree, okay? What's going on? These fruit, and you may find that as well, that even while at picking, they're already anaerobic. They've lost their oxygen internally because of, let's say, the field temperature or whatever, their respiration, and they haven't got the means to get oxygen into the flesh because they are so dense. And so you end up with artificial anaerobic condition inside, which of course generates more CO2, and then you get the cavities. So you may have to start looking at these fruit at harvest, and you may find that the internal, you may pick up ethanol emanation, headspace values or something. You may begin to realize that these fruit are already floating around in an anaerobic condition inside the fruit, even at picking time. And you're stuck with that.
Thanks, Bob. Henk, you had a list. Do you want to continue? You need to unmute.
context is everything. So, man, it is. Yeah, I agree with the density of the fruit. All the new varieties have actually been bred to be dense, and most of the problems that we have are by area or by microclimate producing a very dense fruit, which is I agree. I mean, but does that mean we should actually reverse the Ca and store them in high concentrations of oxygen?
Oh, gosh. That's a good question. Yeah, you're trying to have a super oxygen environment. Well, that's a good research question. By the way, not only are you creating anaerobic condition, but remember what I said, when you get down to low oxygen in this case, internal fruit, the ability for that fruit to produce ethylene is debilitated. And so, as you may know, a lot of people talk about these new varieties as being low ethylene producers. It could be genetic, yes, but it could be because they're so dense that their oxygen internally is so low that they can't produce ethylene, okay? Coming back to your question, yeah, you want to say maybe super oxygen store so that the oxygen is getting from the headspace into the fruit. I think that would have to be looked at by researchers. And Abate Fetel is, of course, the poster variety in pears for that kind of thing. And there are some apple varieties that have the same problem. I think Envy is another one that is very low tolerance for any kind of loss of oxygen. So there are some candidates for what you're suggesting, plus the variety you were talking about.
Good.
Henk, may I quickly comment there on the Fuji Browning that you're talking about? You mentioned the other day is in the part that is not dense. So how does that work?
Who's answering that? I'm not sure. Henk?
Sorry, that was to Henk. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, if you cut where we see the browning on Fuji, if you cut the apple, not like we normally cut it in the middle, you cut the top third. In the one cheek, you get the browning first. So it's in the top third, in the middle of the tissue, which Elke says is, I mean, she did the study, so you have good oxygen concentrations there. That's where the tissue are the thickest, and you normally have in the middle there, you start getting browning or cavity forming. So it is a, I can't understand it.
Henk and Elke, are you familiar with the, it's almost in the same part of the fruit, the Gala, I forget, they come up with a name for it, and I think it's mainly in the US. You see the literature on this out of the US, and I think someplace in the UK, I think, is also reporting the same thing. It's essentially a maturity thing, that part of the fruit is the oldest tissue, so it's probably going to senesce first. And please, everyone has to understand, when you grab an apple, it's not a single aged entity. The apple is actually made up of a population of cells of different ages. And the cells on the sunny side are not the same as the cells on the shady side of an apple. So in that shoulder, that's the oldest and probably the most likely to senesce first. So it's an overmaturity. And I've found that in discussion with the Gala people, they've learned that they have to pick sooner to avoid that senescent browning. And then they put it into, in this case, a low oxygen DCA to really stop any possibility of that showing up after picking. But their first realization was there was overmaturity in that fruit, and it will show up likely in the oldest population of cells, which would be in that shoulder area next to this, we'll call it the stem of the fruit.
No, that makes sense. Even the larger fruit have it. So I think that also kind of correlates to that, or yeah, would suggest that.
Mm-hmm. Does that help, Hank?
Unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, no, it does, because yeah, it makes sense. I never thought of that. It certainly makes sense that there are different ages of the fruit, and that could be because some of the areas that we have, they always have this browning, and you can do whatever you want to do. You just cannot stop it. And we've tried, the New Zealanders have a specific protocol which they treat envy and jazz with. And we tried that on Fuji's of the center of South Africa, which is a summer rainfall area which is a high veld where they grow fruit. So it is a strange environment. I mean, we're at 34, I think they at below 30. I'm just guessing, but yeah, so that's closer to the equator, and they always get it. And even though we cool down, because the slowing of cooling and all that worked, and the step down that we do, but there nothing seems to be foolproof.
Yeah, I think if you check the literature, I think the Cornell people, I think it's stem end browning in Gala apples. There's a number of articles on that. It's actually quite a recent phenomenon that they've stumbled into.
Regis, can I ask something about soft scald? It's something that's starting to appear more and more on apple varieties that I've never seen before. We have many earlier season variants of a golden and a granny, and all of a sudden I'm starting to see even soft scald appearing there. Something I've never known, only known it on jazz, and now I'm seeing it on traditional variety sports, early sports, which I cannot understand.
Okay. There's lots of information on soft scald in the literature. Essentially, if it is soft scald, it is a chilling-induced disorder. So your first line of protection is to avoid putting the fruit into cold storage temperatures. You can do a combination of delayed cooling. Again, my personal experience is with Honeycrisp, and we showed that the soft scald control is better and better as you hold the fruit at warmer and warmer temperatures. This is contrary to what one would have done decades ago. You cool everything rapidly. And so we showed that as you go up, we went up to 30 Celsius, and soft scald disappears if you keep it at 30 Celsius for maybe 2 or 3 days. Obviously, that's a bit hard to do in a packing house. So we settle on 20 Celsius for a day of picking plus 6 days. So, 7 days from picking to the end of that warm period. You can go down to 15 or 10 Celsius, and then your time factor must go up. Okay. So when you finish that, you don't dare go, in our case, we don't dare go below 3 Celsius. If you go below 3 Celsius, you're going to get hit with it. So it's a chilling induced disorder. The other thing that's in the literature that people haven't really grasped onto is that soft scald and its sister, the low temperature breakdown internal flesh, those two go hand in hand. If you see one, you're likely to see the other. They are most likely to happen when you pick fruit in the orchard that are in the climacteric stage. We found that on our own with Honeycrisp, that those two disorders only happened during the optimum maturity, which is really terrible. But we found that if you hold the fruit warm, and then after that warm air stored, then you put your CA on the fruit, it pretty well controlled it. And the low temperature breakdown, the two of those. And if you pick slightly after the optimum maturity, I know some of our local packing houses have said they don't even bother holding it for the 7 days. They've learned that if it's slightly at the end of the optimum harvest window, they don't need to go the full 7 days. Maybe 4 or 5 days of warmth is sufficient. Okay, so take a look at what your context there, see if you're getting it when you're in what you're being told is the optimum harvest window when fruit are just starting their climacteric. That's likely to end up with the most disorder, and you have to counteract with a warm air stored phase and then followed by a slightly warmer storage temperature in long-term storage.
More questions? Unmute if you need to. Fruitways, you had some questions earlier. Are you happy? Looks like no more questions. Yeah?
Wow.
On Golden Delicious, the correlation between the preservation of green color and high CO2 levels, high meaning 2.5% with the oxygen percentage of 1.5%. Yeah, we've tried the DCA on Goldens, especially for the preservation of green color, and we're not satisfied with the DCA. What can you maybe explain the correlation between the preservation of the green color and the high CO2, please?
That's a good question. You know, in the apple world, Golden Delicious is one of the few varieties in which there is a history of recommended high CO2 to preserve green color. There are recommendations of about 8% in some cases that I've found. That's for markets that want green colored Golden Delicious. And I would say that with the DCA, I think you have to revisit that CO2 value and watch how it is, you know, look at the ratio between the CO2 and the oxygen you're using. Again, context, I don't know the actual temperatures and when you let that CO2 show up. It would take a bit more one-on-one discussion with you, but I would encourage you to take a look at that ratio and avoid going above the 1.6 if that seems to be useful to you. If you're going way above it, you're probably getting yourself in trouble. You're chasing after that green, you get it, but you might end up with CO2 damage, unfortunately, if you're putting it in combination with a low oxygen. So if you want to use the CO2 and you want to fix that CO2, you better make sure your oxygen is high enough to respect that 1.6 ratio. That's a starting discussion. And of course, you should know that if you add MCP on Golden Delicious, there is evidence of MCP skin damage on CO2. So watch if you're adding the MCP onto the Golden Delicious.
Good, thank you. Any more questions? Just remember to unmute.
Richard, thank you again, Robert. I just what was just said now makes for us green color is everything. In Africa, we sell Goldens. If they're not completely close to a granny, then they don't get sold. What other things can we do to retain green color? Because we've gone through lists, but perhaps we're missing something.
I would start with the obvious ones, and I guess, you know, for me, I've found one of the big benefits of DCA is green color retention. So I would start by looking at what you're doing in terms of using low oxygen. It in itself is a very good way to preserve green color. And I think one of your presenters pointed that out with, in that case, was Granny Smith, but it's shown in Packham's and other many other varieties, our work, that's one of the obvious benefits of a very low oxygen DCA condition. And I don't ask you to declare what you're doing, but I would say keep it simple and start with that. And if you have any questions like on detail, that feel free to offline put it through to Richard or through your channels, and we can talk a bit more about your specific situation. But certainly look at that low oxygen as it in itself is a very good way to preserve green color.
Thank you. Any more? Fruitways, you happy? No more?
Richard, I would just like to thank Prof. Prange that he came, and it's been really fun actually to kind of interact with somebody who knows so much. Thank you very much.
Can I say in the other direction, thank you very much for your interest. You folks are the first to hear about my thoughts on carbon dioxide in the world. So my compliments to you for having that interest. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob, for a very, very interesting presentation. And thanks also to Andrew Brink for facilitating your participation. And then thanks to all the presenters for today. And also thank you to my team over here that made this possible. And then I also want to mention that we were planning a CA engineers meeting in May this year, which was obviously scuttled by COVID. We're looking at doing a webinar next year, possibly in May, but that may also depend on the Hortgro Science Symposium. But if you have any questions or suggestions for topics from the CA engineer's point of view that you would like to have raised, please forward them to Theo, and then we can start working on an agenda for that. I'd just like to mention again that the presentations will be on the Hortgro website. That's www.hortgro, without the W, .co.za, under the Backhouse Action Group quick link. And then we will try and put together the recording on a YouTube. So we'll see how that progresses, but we have your details so we can inform you as to what is available when. I think it's been a very productive session. Thank you also to all the participants for joining in. And also, if you have any comments or issues you wish to raise, just forward them either to Tia or Wiehann, and we'll take them from there. So once again, thank you very much, and to all the speakers, thank you. And we now declare this meeting closed. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Anyone? Last comment? Right. Okay, we're going to end the proceedings if there's no further comments.